The polished marble floor of Aurelia reflected the crystal chandeliers like a dark, still lake, each point of light a captured star. To the patrons, it was an illusion of celestial grandeur. To Clara Hayes, it was just another surface she had to ensure was free of scuffs from $1,000 shoes. At 22, Clara moved through the opulent dining room with a practiced invisibility, her simple black uniform a shadow against the jewel-toned velvets and gleaming mahogany. She was a ghost who refilled water glasses, cleared away the remnants of feasts, and absorbed the ambient hum of wealth, all while the numbers of her student loan balance ticked silently in the back of her mind. Her life was a careful equation. Tuition for her chemistry degree minus rent for a shoebox apartment, divided by the grueling hours she spent on her feet. The tips at Aurelia were the variable that made it all work, the fragile number that stood between solvency and disaster. And the master of that variable, the man who held her financial stability in his manicured hands, was Julian Croft. Julian wasn't just the manager. He was the self-appointed curator of Aurelia's prestige. In his early 40s, with hair too black to be natural and a smile that never reached his cold, assessing eyes, he glided through the restaurant like a shark in a tailored suit. He didn't manage staff. He cultivated an atmosphere of fear. He believed excellence was forged in the crucible of humiliation, and he was a master blacksmith of shame. "Hayes," his voice, a low hiss, cut through the dining room's murmur. He didn't need to raise it. His tone was a whip. "Table 7. The water glasses are 2/3 full. Are you attempting to dehydrate our clientele?" Clara's shoulders tightened. "No, Mr. Croft. Refilling them now." She moved with quiet efficiency, the heavy glass pitcher cold in her hand. She had learned long ago that apologies were blood in the water for a man like Julian. Brevity and obedience were her only shields. As she attended to table 7, she felt his eyes on her, a physical weight on her back. He wasn't just watching her work. He was inspecting her for flaws, for any crack in her composure he could exploit. This was his ritual, his way of reminding everyone who held the power. He saw her not as a person, but as a component of his perfectly orchestrated machine, and a faulty one at that. Across the room, in a quiet corner booth, sat Arthur Pendleton. In his late 70s, with a face etched by decades of shrewd decisions and a few profound sorrows, he was as much a fixture at Aurelia as the oversized floral arrangements. He came twice a week, always alone, always at the same table. He wore simple, impeccably tailored suits that whispered of old money rather than shouting about new wealth. He never made small talk, rarely smiled, and always tipped exactly 40%, a gesture of quiet respect for the labor he witnessed. Julian fawned over him, presenting him with off-menu specials and vintage wines, but Arthur's responses were always clipped, his attention focused on his food and the worn, leather-bound book he brought with him. Most of the staff were terrified of his stoic silence. Clara, however, found it strangely comforting. He was the one person in the room who seemed to demand nothing from her but competence. He saw her, she felt, as a professional doing her job, not as an inferior to be managed. Tonight, however, something was different. Arthur's book lay closed on the table. His gaze wasn't on his plate of seared scallops, but was drifting, observing. His eyes, a sharp, intelligent blue, briefly met Clara's as Julian berated another waiter for placing a fork a millimeter out of alignment. Arthur's expression didn't change, but a subtle tightening around his jaw spoke volumes. He saw it. He saw the poison that dripped from Julian's perfectly articulated words. Clara moved on to her other tables, her mind a whirlwind of chemical formulas and service protocols. She was an anomaly here. While her colleagues dreamed of tips, she mentally deconstructed the sources, wondering about the Maillard reaction on the steaks, the stability of the foam on the amuse-bouche, the precise pH that gave the vinaigrette its sharp, clean bite. Her passion wasn't serving food, it was understanding it at a molecular level. This job, this palace of performative luxury, was just a means to an end, a temporary purgatory on the path to a laboratory of her own. A sudden, obnoxious laugh boomed from the restaurant's entrance, shattering the carefully curated ambiance. Marcus Thorne had arrived. A real estate developer with a personality as loud as his diamond-encrusted watch, Thorne was Julian's favorite type of patron, obscenely rich and profoundly insecure, a man who measured his worth by the deference he could command. Julian's entire posture changed. He straightened, his cold smile melting into one of sycophantic glee. "Marcus, welcome, welcome. Your table is ready, of course." He led Thorne and his two guests to the best table in the house, Clara's section. Clara's stomach clenched. A night with Marcus Thorne meant a minefield of impossible demands, casual insults, and the constant, suffocating presence of Julian hovering nearby, eager to find fault with her to impress his prize guest. "And get this one to bring us a bottle of the 82 Petrus," Thorne bellowed, gesturing dismissively at Clara without looking at her. "And don't let her drop it. Looks like she can barely hold a tray." Julian chuckled, a sound devoid of genuine humor. "Clara is in training. I will oversee the service personally to ensure it meets your standards." He shot Clara a look that was both a threat and a promise of the torment to come. As Clara headed toward the wine cellar, a wave of weariness washed over her. It wasn't the physical exhaustion. It was the soul-crushing weight of being constantly diminished, of having to shrink herself to survive in this gilded cage. She took a deep, steadying breath. The cool, damp air of the cellar, a brief respite. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her memory, a quiet, firm anchor in the storms of her life. "Dignity, Clara Bell, is the one thing they can't take from you unless you give it away." She found the bottle, its dusty label a testament to its exorbitant price. Holding it, she felt a tremor in her hands, not from nerves but from a low, simmering rage. Julian and Marcus saw her as nothing, a pair of hands, a uniform, an object. They had no idea who she was, what she knew, or the scientific precision with which she observed their world. They saw a waitress. They didn't see the chemist who was beginning to notice that something in the magnificent kitchen of Aurelia was fundamentally, dangerously wrong. If you have ever been judged by your uniform instead of your mind, if you have ever been forced to swallow your pride just to pay the bills, then what Clara uncovers next will ignite a fire within you. Because tonight, the most expensive thing in this restaurant isn't the wine. It's the truth, and the price for hiding it is about to come due. The air at Thorne's table was thick with arrogance. He held court, his voice a tidal wave of self-congratulation that washed over the nearby tables, forcing other diners to raise their own voices in response. Julian stood beside him, a rapt disciple, laughing too loudly at jokes that weren't funny, and nodding vigorously at opinions that were baseless. Clara moved around them, a satellite in a hostile orbit, her presence acknowledged only when something was required. "Girl!" Thorne snapped, waving a bejeweled hand. "More bread. And tell the chef not to burn it this time. It was a little too rustic." "Of course, sir," Clara said, her voice a carefully modulated monotone. The bread had been perfect, but perfection was irrelevant. The point was the command, the assertion of dominance. As she returned from the kitchen with a fresh basket, she noticed it again. A faint, almost imperceptible smell coming from the service pass. It wasn't the rich, savory aroma of roasting meats or the bright scent of fresh herbs. It was a subtle, acrid undertone, sharp and slightly chemical, the kind of smell she'd learned to identify in her organic chemistry lab. It smelled like a solvent, trying to mask something else. Most would dismiss it as part of the cacophony of kitchen smells, but to her trained nose, it was a discordant note in a symphony, a sign that an instrument was out of tune. She placed the bread on the table, her eyes briefly scanning the plates of the other diners. Nothing seemed amiss. Yet the feeling persisted, a nagging scientific curiosity that she couldn't shake. Julian followed her back to a service station, his body blocking her path. "Your performance this evening is barely adequate, Hayes," he whispered, his voice of venomous silk. "Mr. Thorne is a friend of the owner. He is not to be disappointed. Your tip, and perhaps your continued employment, depends on your ability to become invisible, yet instantly available. Do you understand the paradox?" "Yes, Mr. Croft." "Good." He straightened his tie, a gesture of profound self-satisfaction. "Now, they're ready for the main course. The ortolan. I trust you know the ceremony?" Clara's stomach turned. The ortolan, a tiny songbird, was a controversial and largely illegal dish, a relic of grotesque culinary cruelty. It was prepared and eaten in a bizarre ritual, with diners draping large white napkins over their heads to, as tradition held, hide their gluttonous sin from the eyes of God. Aurelia didn't have it on the menu. It was a secret offering for special patrons like Thorne, a symbol of a level of wealth that operated above laws and ethics. "I've read the service notes, sir," she said, her voice tight. "See that you follow them precisely," he warned, before gliding back to Thorne's side. As the kitchen prepared the forbidden dish, Clara found herself near Arthur Pendleton's table. He was observing the scene at Thorne's table with a look of quiet, undisguised contempt. For the first time all evening, he spoke to her about something other than the menu. "That man," he said, his voice a low rumble, nodding slightly toward Thorne. "Does he believe volume is a substitute for substance?" The question was so unexpected, so direct, that Clara was momentarily stunned. "He is a valued customer, sir." Arthur let out a short, dry huff that might have been a laugh. "Valued for his wallet, perhaps, not for his character." He looked at her then, his gaze piercing. "It takes a great deal of fortitude to endure such people with grace, young lady. A great deal." It was a simple acknowledgement, but to Clara it felt like a lifeline. He saw her. He saw the effort. It was a small deposit of strength in an account that was perilously overdrawn. The ortolan arrived from the kitchen on a silver platter, covered by a gleaming cloche. The acrid smell was stronger now, clinging to the heated silver. As Clara carried the platter, her mind raced. Solvents were sometimes used in creating cheap, artificial flavorings, flavor essences that mimicked rare and expensive ingredients. Was it possible? In a restaurant of this caliber? It seemed unthinkable. And yet, the evidence of her senses was undeniable. She approached Thorne's table, her heart pounding. Julian stood ready with the large white napkins. "Ah, the moment of truth," Thorne boomed. Julian presented the napkins with a theatrical flourish. "To savor the aroma, gentlemen, and to shield your pleasure from the envious." As Thorne and his guests draped the napkins over their heads, a grotesque tableau of hooded figures at a feast, Clara lifted the cloche. The birds were tiny, roasted to a golden brown, resting on a bed of herbs. But the aroma that wafted up was not the pure, rich scent of roasted game she expected. It was a complex, almost perfumed scent, with that same sharp, chemical note now impossible to ignore. It was trying to be truffle, she realized, but it was a clumsy, synthetic forgery. Her eyes darted to the side of one of the birds, a tiny, almost invisible glistening. Not fat. Something else. An oil. An infused oil designed to impart a powerful, overwhelming aroma. An aroma that didn't belong. This was more than just a culinary shortcut. High-end artificial flavorings were one thing, but cheap, industrial-grade compounds could contain impurities, solvents that weren't fully evaporated, contaminants that could be toxic. The dish itself was a moral crime, but this was a chemical one. She placed the plates with trembling hands, her mind a frantic slideshow of molecular structures. She thought of the restaurant's recent cost-cutting memos, Julian's obsession with profit margins, his private meetings with a new, cheaper food supplier she'd seen making deliveries through the back alley. Julian, noticing her slight hesitation, shot her a look of pure fury. She quickly retreated, her mind reeling. She was a waitress, a chemistry student. What could she possibly do? Accusing the restaurant of serving fraudulent, potentially dangerous food would be professional suicide. Julian would not only fire her, he would destroy her reputation, ensuring she never worked in this city again. She looked over at Arthur Pendleton. He was watching her, his brow furrowed in concern. He had noticed her trembling hands. He had seen the look of profound disturbance on her face as she served that dish. He didn't know the science, but he knew people, and he knew he was witnessing something far more significant than a simple case of nerves. Clara stood by the service station, her back to the dining room, trying to regulate her breathing. She had a choice. She could say nothing, collect her tip, pay her tuition, and live with the knowledge of the lie. She could protect her fragile stability. Or she could honor the truth that her education had equipped her to see. Her grandmother's voice returned, clearer this time. There's a difference between keeping your head down and burying it in the sand, Clara Bell. She looked at her hands, the hands of a waitress, but in her mind she saw them holding a beaker, titrating a solution, separating compounds. She was a scientist, and a scientist does not ignore the data. The decision settled in her with a terrifying, liberating calm. She would not be silent. Julian Croft thought she was an idiot, a nobody, a disposable part of the scenery. He was about to discover how dangerously he had underestimated the girl who cleared his tables. The moment stretched, thin and taut, like the surface tension on a drop of water just before it breaks. The three hooded figures at Thorne's table began to eat, their movements hidden beneath the white linen. The sounds were grotesque, a mixture of crunching bones and satisfied murmurs. Julian watched them with the pride of a showman whose grand illusion was a success. He was oblivious, basking in the glow of a fraud he had orchestrated. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the steady hum of the dining room. She had the knowledge, but what was knowledge without a voice? What was truth without the power to make it heard? She took one last, steadying look at Arthur Pendleton. He was still watching, his gaze a silent, questioning anchor in her storm. It was all the encouragement she needed. She walked from the shadows of the service station into the light of the main floor. Each step was deliberate, a declaration. She was no longer a ghost. She was a presence. She walked directly to Julian, who was pouring another glass of obscenely expensive wine for Thorne. "Mr. Croft," she said, her voice low but clear, cutting through his fawning. "I need to speak with you. Urgently." Julian turned, his face a mask of incandescent rage. The audacity of this girl, interrupting him in front of Marcus Thorne. "Hayes," he hissed, his voice barely a whisper, but laced with enough venom to kill. "Are you insane? Get back to your station before I have you thrown out into the street." "It's about the ortolan, sir," Clara persisted, holding her ground. Her voice didn't waver. "There is something wrong with the dish." Thorne, pulling the napkin from his head, his face flushed and greasy, let out a bark of laughter. "Wrong with it? It's magnificent. What's this little girl babbling about, Julian? Did you hire her from an asylum?" The insult bounced off the armor of Clara's newfound resolve. She met Julian's furious gaze directly. "The truffle aroma," she said, her voice gaining strength. "It's synthetic. I believe it's a cheap industrial compound, not a culinary-grade infusion. The solvent base hasn't been properly evaporated." The dining room, which had been a low murmur, began to quiet. Diners at nearby tables paused, forks halfway to their mouths, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. This was no longer a private staff issue. It was a public confrontation. Julian's face went from red to a blotchy, dangerous white. "You are a waitress," he spat, enunciating each word as if it were a physical blow. "You fetch plates. You pour water. You are not a chemist. You are not a chef. You are a nobody who is about to be a jobless nobody. Now get out of my sight." "I may be a waitress, Mr. Croft," Clara said, her voice rising now, clear and resonant, capturing the attention of the entire room. "But I am also a third-year chemistry major, specializing in food science, and I know the smell of 2,4-dithiapentane when I smell it. It's the primary compound in cheap truffle aroma, often suspended in solvents that can be harmful if ingested. The dish you just served is a fraud, and it may be dangerous." A collective gasp swept through the room. The silence that followed was absolute, profound. Every eye was on them. Thorne slammed his fist on the table. "This is an outrage! Julian, fire her! Fire her, and sue her for slander!" Julian lunged forward, grabbing Clara's arm, his fingers digging into her flesh like talons. "You are finished," he seethed, his face inches from hers. "You will never work again. I will personally see to it. Let go of her." The voice was not loud, but it carried the unquestionable weight of command. It sliced through the tension, turning every head. Arthur Pendleton was standing. He had placed his book on the table and was walking toward them, his movements slow, deliberate, each step echoing in the cavernous silence. His calm, elderly demeanor had vanished, replaced by an aura of cold, immense power. Julian froze, his hand still clamped on Clara's arm. He looked at Arthur in disbelief. "Mr. Pendleton, this is an internal staff matter, a hysterical employee. I am handling it." Arthur ignored him completely. His sharp blue eyes were fixed on Clara. He stopped a few feet away, his gaze analytical, searching. He wasn't swooping in to rescue a damsel in distress. He was a scientist of a different sort, a scientist of people and investments, and he was gathering data. 2,4-dithiapentane, he said, his voice a low rumble. An interesting assertion. Most synthetic truffle oils use B-methylthiomethane. It's more stable. Why do you specify the former? It was a test, a highly specific, technical question designed to expose a bluff. Julian and Thorne stared, uncomprehending, but Clara's eyes lit up with the fire of intellectual challenge. This was her territory. Because bis-methylthio. Methane has a cleaner, more garlicky note, she answered instantly, her voice steady and confident. What I smell has a sharper, more petroleum-like undertone, which is characteristic of lower-grade 2,4-dithiapentane, especially when the refining process is rushed to cut costs. It's cheaper to produce, but it's more volatile. Arthur's eyebrows rose almost imperceptibly, a flicker of something. Respect, surprise, confirmation passed through his eyes. He had his data. He turned his gaze to Julian, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "Let go of her arm. Now." Julian, stunned by the turn of events, released Clara as if her skin had suddenly become white hot. He stammered, "Mr. Pendleton, I assure you she is delusional. Our ingredients are of the highest quality." "Are they?" Arthur replied, his voice dangerously soft. He took a small, clean bread plate from a nearby table. He walked over to Thorne's plate, took a fork, and scraped a small sample of the sauce and oil from the side of the remaining bird. He held it up to the light, then brought it to his nose, inhaling sharply. He didn't taste it. He didn't need to. His expression hardened into granite. He turned back to Julian. "I started my first company 45 years ago," he said, his voice resonating with quiet authority. "It was an industrial chemical analysis firm. We specialized in identifying contaminants in food and fragrance products for corporate clients. I sold it for a fortune, but I never forgot the smell of cheap shortcuts." He held the plate out. "This young lady is correct. This is not culinary grade. This is garbage. You are serving garbage to your customers at $1,000 a plate." The room was a tableau of shock. Marcus Thorne's jaw hung open. Julian Croft looked as if he had been turned to stone. Arthur's gaze swept over them, cold and unforgiving. Then he looked at Julian, a predator who had finally cornered his prey. "You seemed to be under the impression that Marcus Thorne was the most important person in this room," Arthur said, his voice dropping to a near whisper that was more terrifying than any shout. "You fawned over his money. You bent to his will. You humiliated your staff to impress him." He took a step closer to Julian. "You made a grave miscalculation. You see, Mr. Thorne is a guest in this restaurant, a temporary occupant." Arthur paused, letting the weight of his next words settle in the silent room. "I," he said, his voice as final as a gavel strike, "am the one who owns it. If you have ever watched a tyrant's world crumble to dust in a single moment, then the fallout from this revelation will leave you breathless. The foundation of Aurelia didn't just crack, it shattered. And in the ruins, a new power structure was about to be built, not on wealth or fear, but on the unshakable bedrock of truth. Don't go anywhere, because the real reckoning has only just begun." The silence that followed Arthur Pendleton's declaration was a living thing. It was heavier than the crystal chandeliers, more fragile than the wine glasses. In that moment, Julian Croft's meticulously constructed world of power and prestige evaporated, leaving behind only the pathetic, trembling man who had built it on a foundation of lies. His face, a moment before twisted with rage, was now a slack, ashen mask of pure terror. You're the owner," he stammered, the words catching in his. The silence that descended upon Aurelia was not empty. It was a physical presence, a vacuum that sucked the air from the room, leaving only the sharp, acrid scent of Julian's ruin and the lingering, fraudulent aroma of truffle oil. Julian Croft, a man who had orchestrated his life with the precision of a tyrant, stood frozen, his face a canvas of disbelief, morphing into the grey, crumbling texture of terror. The words, "I am the one who owns it," did not just hang in the air. They dismantled him, atom by atom. His throat worked, but the gasp that emerged was dry, a dead leaf skittering across pavement. "Mr. Pendleton, He was a conductor whose orchestra had vanished, leaving him waving a useless baton in a soundless hall. The power he had wielded, a currency of fear and humiliation, was suddenly revealed to be counterfeit. Arthur Pendleton regarded him with the dispassionate curiosity of a biologist examining a specimen under glass. There was no rage in his expression, only a profound, chilling disappointment. "You heard me, Julian. For 18 months, I have sat in that booth and watched you. I watched you belittle your staff. I watched you prioritize sycophancy over substance. I watched you cultivate an atmosphere as toxic as the chemicals you have been serving in your food." He gestured with the small plate, a prosecutor presenting his final, damning piece of evidence. "All to inflate your profit margins by a few percentage points. You have been poisoning my investment, my reputation, and my customers, all for the price of a few expensive suits." Marcus Thorne, ever the opportunist, began to scramble. "Arthur, please," he oozed, his voice stripped of its earlier bombast. "This is on him. I am as much a victim here as anyone." Arthur's gaze, sharp as a shard of ice, flicked to him. "A victim? You demanded this performance. You reveled in the humiliation of the staff. You are a symptom of the disease Julian cultivated, Thorne. You are not a victim. You are a willing participant in the rot." He turned his back on Thorne, a dismissal more absolute than any curse. His focus returned to the true epicenter of the disaster. "My security team, who you know as the quiet diners at table 2, will escort you out. You are fired, of course. That is the least of it. A full legal and financial audit will begin at 9 a.m. tomorrow. I suspect what we find will be of great interest to the district attorney's office." As if summoned by his words, the 2 men from table 2 rose. Their movements were fluid, economical, and utterly final. They flanked Julian, their presence a silent, immovable reality. Julian looked wildly around the room, at the faces of the staff he had terrorized, searching for... what? An ally? Pity. He found neither. He saw only the blank, watchful faces of people witnessing a long overdue execution. His eyes finally fell on Clara, and for a fleeting second, a flicker of pure, unadulterated hatred burned there. He saw her not as his downfall, but as an incomprehensible anomaly, a faulty gear that had inexplicably shattered the entire machine. Then, the hatred was extinguished by a wave of utter defeat. He sagged between the 2 security men and allowed himself to be led away, a ghost finally exorcised from the grand room he had haunted. The moment the main doors closed behind him, the vacuum of silence was broken, not by applause, but by a collective, shuddering exhale. It was the sound of 100 held breaths being released at once. Clara felt her own lungs empty, and a dizzying wave of lightheadedness washed over her. Her legs, which had felt like steel pillars, suddenly trembled. The adrenaline that had sharpened her senses and fortified her voice was draining away, leaving behind a raw, buzzing exhaustion. Arthur Pendleton walked over to his booth and retrieved his worn leather book. He then turned to the stunned dining room. "To our guests," he said, his voice calm and authoritative. "Tonight's meal is, of course, complimentary. I apologize sincerely that the experience at Aurelia has fallen so catastrophically short of its promise. We will be closing for a period of reassessment. Thank you for your patience." To the staff, he said simply, "Go home. Rest. You will all be paid in full for the week. We will be in contact soon." It was an orderly, controlled dismantling of the evening, but for Clara, the world was still spinning. She stood rooted to the spot, the business card he had given her feeling impossibly heavy in her hand. She felt 100 pairs of eyes on her, a mixture of awe, confusion, and perhaps even a little fear from her former colleagues. She was no longer just Clara, the waitress. She had become something else, something she didn't yet have a name for. As the room began to clear, Arthur approached her. The stern owner was gone, replaced by the quiet, observant man from the corner booth. "Miss Hayes," he began. "Clara," she corrected him automatically, her voice barely a whisper. "Clara," he acknowledged with a small, tired smile. "I imagine you are feeling a great deal right now." She could only nod, her throat too tight for words. "Let's sit for a moment," he suggested, gesturing to his booth. "The world does not right itself in 5 minutes." She followed him, sinking into the soft leather. For hours she had seen this table as a distant, quiet island in the chaotic sea of the restaurant. Now she was on it, and the perspective was utterly disorienting. He didn't speak immediately. He simply sat, allowing the silence to become comfortable, a balm rather than a tension. "You have a remarkable mind, Clara," he said finally, looking not at her, but at the patterns of light on the marble floor. "You see the world on a different level. Most people see a plate of food. You see the reactions, the compounds, the truth beneath the surface. I saw it in your eyes weeks ago. The way you watched the kitchen, the way you analyzed everything. You weren't just serving. You were observing." I knew it was wrong," she stammered, feeling the need to explain. "The science was wrong. If the science is wrong, the whole thing is a lie." "Precisely," he said, turning his piercing blue eyes to her. "Integrity is not a moral concept, Clara. It is a structural one. A bridge without structural integrity collapses. A business without ethical integrity does the same. You simply saw the cracks before anyone else." He leaned forward slightly. "The offer I made you in the heat of the moment was not hyperbole. It stands. But it is not a reward for a single act of bravery. It is an investment in a specific way of thinking. My organization needs that. The scholarship. The job. It was all too much, a tidal wave of fortune that threatened to drown her. Sir, Mr. Pendleton, I'm a student. I clear tables. I don't know how to run a division. I don't need you to run it today, he said patiently. I need you to learn. I need you to finish your education, not with the weight of financial desperation on your shoulders, but with the freedom to truly excel. I need you to bring the discipline of the scientific method to the art of hospitality. We have enough people who understand profit. We need more people who understand principle. He stood up. Go home, Clara. Get some sleep. My assistant, Eleanor, will call you in the morning to handle the formalities of the scholarship. We can speak more about the rest later. Tonight was about tearing something down. The real work, the work of building something better, begins tomorrow. Walking out of Aurelia that night was an out-of-body experience. The cool night air felt strange on her skin, as if she were breathing for the first time. The city sounds, a distant siren, the rumble of the subway, were muted, filtered through the thick cotton of her shock. She took the train home, sitting amongst the tired commuters, an anonymous face in the crowd. No one on that train car could possibly know that her life had just fractured into a before and an after. Her apartment, when she finally let herself in, was a shock to the system. It was a shoebox, a tiny space defined by its limitations. The worn linoleum, the second-hand armchair, the stack of textbooks that served as a nightstand. It was the architecture of her struggle. For years, this place had been her sanctuary, the only space where she could shed the invisible uniform of the service worker and just be herself. Tonight, it felt alien. It was a relic of a life that had ended 3 hours ago. She didn't turn on the lights. She sat in the dark on the edge of her bed, the city lights painting, shifting patterns on the wall. The business card was still in her hand. She could feel the crisp edges, the embossed lettering of his name, Arthur Pendleton. It was a tangible piece of a new reality she couldn't yet grasp. Imposter syndrome a familiar ghost, whispered in the corners of the room. A fluke, a lucky break. You're just a waitress who got lucky. She had spoken up, yes, but it was Arthur who had held all the power. Without him, she would be on the street, her career in ashes. She stood and walked to her small desk, her fingers tracing the spine of her organic chemistry textbook. She opened it to a random page, a complex diagram of a molecular synthesis, reagents, catalysts, transition states, products. Her life had been a slow, difficult reaction, inching toward a goal. Tonight, Arthur Pendleton had acted as a catalyst, dramatically lowering the activation energy required for change. But a catalyst doesn't create the reaction. It only speeds up one that is already possible. The potential, the reagents, her knowledge, her grandmother's lessons on dignity, her own simmering frustration, had been there all along. A profound calm settled over her. She was not an imposter. She had earned this. Not the job, not the money, but the right to be heard. She had spent years accumulating knowledge, and tonight she had finally converted that knowledge into power. A quiet tectonic shift occurred within her. The exhaustion remained, but beneath it was a new foundation, solid and sure. She fell asleep in her clothes, the chemistry book open beside her, dreaming of structures being built, not torn down. The days that followed were a masterclass in controlled deconstruction and thoughtful rebuilding, orchestrated by Arthur and his fiercely competent assistant, Eleanor. The audit of Aurelia was as brutal as Arthur had predicted. It unearthed a systemic web of fraud orchestrated by Julian, from the dangerous food substitutions to kickbacks from suppliers and manipulated inventory records. Clara was asked to participate, not as a witness, but as an expert. She spent 2 days with the forensic accountants and food safety experts, walking them through the kitchen's workflow, pointing out anomalies in the ordering patterns, explaining the chemical shortcuts she had suspected. It was strange, standing in the silent, brightly lit kitchen with these serious professionals. Her former colleagues were gone, on paid leave. She was no longer a waitress here, but she wasn't a manager either. She was something new, a hybrid. She saw the subtle shift in how the auditors addressed her. Initially, she was the girl who noticed the smell. By the end of the first day, she was Ms. Hayes, the one they turned to when they needed to understand the practical application of the fraud. The most difficult part was the series of meetings Arthur held with the entire staff. He insisted Clara be present for them. He wanted the staff to see the new center of gravity in the organization. In a sterile conference room, he listened as waiters, busboys, and line cooks, one by one, shared their stories of Julian's reign. They spoke of casual cruelty, of tips being unfairly docked, of a constant, grinding fear that stifled any creativity or pride in their work. Clara listened, her heart aching. She had been so consumed by her own struggle that she hadn't fully appreciated the scope of the collective suffering. She was not the only one who had been diminished. After one particularly harrowing story from a young waiter, Julian had fired for being 5 minutes late, Arthur turned to Clara. "This is why quality control isn't just about ingredients, Clara," he said quietly, for her benefit alone. "It's about the people. A toxic culture is the most dangerous contaminant of all. It spoils everything it touches." Her scholarship was finalized. The call from Eleanor was brisk, efficient, and kind. A wire transfer was made to the university, covering not only her remaining tuition, but her past loans as well. When Clara saw the zero balance on her loan portal, she broke down and wept. It wasn't about the money. It was the sudden, shocking absence of a weight she had carried for so long she had forgotten what it felt like to stand up straight. It was freedom. Her mentorship with Arthur began in earnest. They met twice a week in his quiet, sunlit office, high above the city, a room that smelled of old books and fresh coffee. He gave her assignments. She was to draft a new code of conduct for suppliers. She was to research innovative quality control technologies. He gave her books to read on supply chain ethics, on leadership philosophy, on the history of French gastronomy. He was not training a manager. He was forging a mind. "Never stop being a scientist, Clara," he told her during one session after she had presented a detailed proposal for implementing gas chromatography mass spectrometry to spot-check incoming oils and spices. Approach every problem as a hypothesis. Gather data. Test it. Be willing to be proven wrong. An ego is the enemy of accuracy. One afternoon, he unrolled blueprints on his large mahogany desk. They were for the gutted restaurant. "We are rebuilding from the studs out," he said. "New kitchen, new layout, new identity. It needs a new name." He looked at her. "I want to call it the Haze." Clara was speechless. A hot blush crept up her neck. "No," she said, the word coming out faster than she intended. "Sir, you can't. That's—" "No." "Why not?" he asked, genuinely curious. "Because it's my name. I'm just me. A restaurant name should be elegant, classic. Aurelia meant the golden one," Arthur interrupted gently. "It was a name that promised luxury, a promise it failed to keep. The Haze, on the other hand, stands for something real. It stands for integrity. It stands for the idea that the person with the clearest sight, regardless of their station, is the most valuable person in the room. It's a better promise." She looked at the blueprints, at the clean lines and thoughtful design, and then at the kind, unyielding face of the man who believed in her more than she believed in herself. Saying yes felt like an act of impossible arrogance, but saying no felt like a betrayal of everything he was trying to build. "Okay," she whispered, the word feeling enormous in her mouth. "Okay." Opening night at the Haze was 6 months later. The transformation was absolute. The opulent, heavy decor of Aurelia was gone, replaced with an aesthetic of clean lines, warm wood, natural light, and an open kitchen that put the craft of the chefs on full display. The atmosphere was not one of hushed, reverent wealth, but of vibrant, confident excellence. The staff, a mix of retained talent from Aurelia and new hires, moved with a relaxed pride that had been unthinkable under Julian's rule. Clara, in a simple, elegant navy dress, felt a nervous flutter she hadn't experienced since her first day as a waitress. Her title was on the menu, discreetly at the bottom: Clara Hayes, Director of Quality and Standards. Seeing it in print was both terrifying and exhilarating. She wasn't serving tables tonight. She was a guardian of the promise, moving between the kitchen and the dining room, her senses alive, observing, ensuring every detail was not just correct, but true. Her final stop of the evening was the corner booth. Arthur was waiting for her. It was the only table he had reserved. A single bottle of wine, a modest but exceptional vintage, sat breathing on the table. "Sit, Clara," he said, his eyes twinkling. "The architect must admire her work." "It's your work, sir." "Nonsense. I am just the money." He waved a dismissive hand. "You are the principal. Tell me, what do you see?" She looked around the room, her chemist's mind taking inventory. She saw the Maillard reaction, perfectly browning the scallops at the pass. She saw the stable emulsion in the vinaigrettes being dressed on the salads. She heard the sound of a happy, functional team in the kitchen, a complex but harmonious reaction. She saw patrons who were not performing wealth, but simply enjoying a beautiful meal. "I see. A system in equilibrium," she said, a small smile playing on her lips. "A beautiful way to put it. He nodded, pouring her a glass of wine. To equilibrium. They clinked glasses. The food arrived, course after course, each dish a testament to the new philosophy. Simple, honest ingredients, prepared with scientific precision and artistic flair. They spoke of her final year of classes, of a new project he was considering for the hospitality group, of the simple pleasure of a perfectly cooked piece of fish. As the evening wound down, Arthur leaned back, a look of deep contentment on his face. You know, that night, when you walked up to Julian, you changed more than just your own life. You reminded an old man what his life's work was supposed to be about. Not acquiring things, but building things. Things with integrity. He looked at her, his gaze direct and filled with a paternal warmth that touched her deeply. You never have to wear a uniform of invisibility again, Clara. Your mind is your authority. Never let anyone persuade you otherwise. Clara looked out at the dining room of the Hays. She thought of her grandmother's voice, the anchor in the storm. Dignity is the one thing they can't take from you, unless you give it away. She hadn't given it away, and in holding on to it, she had created a space where no one else would have to give theirs away either. The restaurant wasn't just named for her, it was an embodiment of her journey. The future was no longer a frantic equation of tuition minus rent, a variable balanced on the knife's edge of a tyrant's whim. It was an open field of inquiry, a laboratory of her own making. The work was just beginning. There were new hypotheses to test, new structures to build. The storm was over, and the chemist, at last, was home.